The photo loaded slowly on my phone, one line of pixels at a time, and by the time it finished, my hands had gone cold. My daughter was standing on a white beach in the Maldives, her new husband's arm around her waist, and on her right hand, catching the sun in a way I would have known anywhere, in any lighting, in any lifetime, was Diane's ring. The ring I had buried my wife without because I could not bear to take it off her finger, until the funeral director gently told me the ring belonged with the living. The ring I had locked in a safe deposit box for 6 years. The ring my daughter had just used to pay for a honeymoon. Thank you so much for being here with me tonight. It means more than you know. If you're watching this, wherever you are, drop your city or your country in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And before we go further, I want to be upfront with you. This story blends real patterns of family betrayal with details that have been adapted for privacy and for the sake of telling it properly. Names have been changed, but the lessons inside it are as real as anything you will ever live through. Stay with me until the end, because what my daughter did to get that ring was only the beginning of what she was planning to take. My name is Walter Higgins. I am 67 years old, and for 38 of those years, I was married to a woman named Diane Higgins, who I loved with a kind of stubborn, uncomplicated devotion that I never once had to work at. We met in 1986 at a community college registration line, both of us signing up for the same night class in accounting, both of us secretly hoping we wouldn't get called on. She had a laugh that made strangers turn around in restaurants. She kept a garden that outcompeted every other yard on our street in Fairhaven, Ohio, and she never once let me win an argument just because I looked tired. We had one daughter, Ashley, born in 1992, 3 years after we'd nearly given up trying. Ashley was the kind of child who colored inside the lines before anyone taught her to. She brought home report cards that made Diane cry from pride. She was, for the first 25 years of her life, everything a father could want, and I want you to understand that I am not telling you this story to make her sound like a monster from the beginning. She wasn't. Something changed in her, slowly, the way rust changes metal, and I did not see it happening until it was already through to the bone. I ran a hardware supply business for 34 years, Higgins Fastener and Supply, 3 locations across 2 counties, the kind of business that doesn't make anyone rich but makes a family comfortable if you're careful and a little stubborn about not overextending yourself. Diane kept our books for the first decade, sitting at our kitchen table 3 nights a week with a calculator and a stack of invoices, and she used to tell me that the secret to money was never letting it get louder than your judgment. I think about that phrase more now than I ever did while she was alive to say it. We built the trust the way we built everything else in our life together, slowly, with more caution than ambition. In 2015, we sold a small rental duplex we'd owned since the early 90s, a property that had given us headaches more often than profit, and instead of putting the proceeds toward a vacation home or an early retirement, Diane suggested we set it aside entirely for Ashley, untouched, growing quietly in the background of our lives. She's going to need something steady one day, Diane said, something that isn't tied to whatever mistakes she makes along the way. I remember laughing a little at the time, because Ashley was 23 then, freshly graduated, dating a string of forgettable young men, seemingly incapable of the kind of mistake serious enough to need a safety net. I didn't understand yet how right my wife's instinct would turn out to be, nor how much it would cost us both to find out. Diane was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2018. She fought it for 14 months with a grace that still humbles me to think about. She died on a Tuesday morning in July of 2019, with my hand in hers and Ashley asleep in the chair by the window, exhausted from 3 days of vigil. The ring on her hand that morning was the one I had proposed with in 1985, a modest solitaire I had saved 11 months to afford, plus the wedding band we'd added in 1995 when I could finally afford to upgrade it properly. Diane called it her whole hand, the 2 rings together, and she never took them off, not once, not even to garden. At the funeral home, the director asked me gently whether I wanted the rings buried with her or kept. I could not speak. Ashley, 27 years old at the time, put her hand on my arm and said, "Dad, Mom would want you to keep them. She'd want them to stay in the family." I believed her. I still believe she meant it, that day. I had the rings cleaned and appraised the following month. The jeweler, a man named Solomon Petrikis who had done work for us for 20 years, valued the pair at $14,000, mostly sentimental rather than the stones themselves, though the center diamond had appreciated considerably since 1985. I put both rings in a safe deposit box at Fairhaven Trust and Savings, and I told myself I would give them to Ashley one day, when she got married, so that some piece of her mother could stand beside her at the altar. Ashley married Brandon Cole in September of 2023, 4 years after Diane died. I gave her the rings myself, at a small dinner 2 weeks before the wedding, in the kitchen where Diane used to bake, and I watched my daughter cry the kind of tears that felt, at the time, completely real. "I'm going to wear the diamond every day, Dad," she told me. "And I'm going to save the band for my own daughter someday, if I ever have one." I hugged her and told her that was exactly right, that was exactly what her mother would have wanted, and for 11 months, as far as I knew, that was exactly what happened. I found out otherwise on a Thursday night in October of 2024, scrolling through Instagram after dinner alone, the way I did most nights since Diane died and Ashley moved 40 minutes away to Brandon's side of town. Ashley had posted a series of photos from their honeymoon, delayed a year because of Brandon's work schedule, 12 pictures from a resort in the Maldives with captions about paradise and finally getting their moment. In the 4th photo, she was holding a cocktail up to the camera, laughing, her right hand extended toward the lens. And on that hand was a ring I did not recognize. Smaller stone, yellow gold instead of white, a setting I had never seen in my life. I sat with that for a moment, confused more than alarmed. Then I scrolled to a photo from 2 years earlier, her engagement announcement, where her hand rested on Brandon's shoulder and Diane's diamond caught the studio lighting exactly the way I remembered it catching the light at our kitchen table. I went back to the honeymoon photo. I zoomed in as far as my old eyes and my phone screen would allow. It was not the same ring. It was not even close. My chest did something I don't have good words for. I called her. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I told myself there was an explanation, that she'd had it resized, that the lighting in the Maldives photo was different, that I was a 67-year-old man squinting at pixels on a phone and building a tragedy out of nothing. I told myself that for about 6 hours, until I couldn't tell myself that anymore, and I picked up the phone and called someone who would actually know how to find the truth instead of just hoping for it. If you're still with me, drop the word watching in the comments so I know you're here for what comes next, because what I found over the following 3 weeks was so much worse than a missing ring. The person I called was Regina Alvarez, a woman I'd known for 15 years through the Rotary Club, who had spent 22 years as a claims investigator before retiring and picking up private investigation work on the side because, as she put it, she liked knowing things other people didn't want her to know. I met her the next morning at a diner on Route 9, the kind of place with bottomless coffee and a laminated menu that hadn't changed since 1998. "Walter, you look like a man who hasn't slept," she said when she sat down across from me. "I haven't," I admitted. I showed her the 2 photos side by side on my phone. She studied them for a long moment, zoomed in, zoomed out, tilted the phone under the diner's fluorescent light. "That's not the same ring," she said finally. "Different setting, different metal, different stone cut. Somebody swapped it, or somebody sold the original and replaced it with something cheaper to keep the story going in family photos." "That ring was my wife's," I said. "It's the last thing of hers that mattered to me." Regina nodded slowly, the way people do when they've heard 100 versions of this same sentence and know exactly how much weight it's carrying. Do you want me to find out what happened to it? Because if I start pulling this thread, Walter, I want you to understand something. Once I start, I don't stop halfway. I find out everything, not just the ring. I thought about Diane's hand on that kitchen table the night I gave the rings to Ashley. I thought about the promise about saving the band for a granddaughter who might never exist. Find out everything, I said. Regina started with the jewelers. Fairhaven only had 4 of them worth checking, plus 2 pawn shops on the county line that did legitimate appraisal work alongside their usual business. It took her 4 days. On the 5th day, she called me at 7:40 in the morning, her voice flat in the way people get when they've found something they wish they hadn't. Gallows pawn and jewelry, out on Route 4, she said. Owner remembers the transaction because of the size of it. A young woman matching Ashley's description, driver's license matched the name Ashley Cole, sold a diamond ring in March of this year for $11,200. He photographed it for his records, standard practice for anything over $5,000. I have the photo, Walter. It's your wife's ring. March. 7 months before the honeymoon photos. I did the math without wanting to. The honeymoon had been booked, according to Ashley's own social media posts, in April, 1 month after the pawn shop transaction. $11,200. The Maldives trip, based on the resort tags in her photos, a 5-star property I recognized from an ad I'd seen once in an airline magazine, would have cost somewhere in that exact range for 2 people for 10 days. She had sold her mother's ring to pay for a honeymoon, and then bought a cheap replacement to wear in photos so that nobody, especially not me, would ever notice it was gone. I want to pause here and say something directly to you, because I know some of you are parents, and some of you are grandparents, and some of you have given something precious to a child trusting they would understand its weight. I did not confront Ashley that day. Every instinct in my body wanted to drive to her house and demand an explanation. But something held me back, some old habit from 40 years of managing a hardware supply business, where I had learned the hard way that the person you confront with only half the evidence is the person who gets to control the story afterward. I needed the whole story first. Please, if this resonates with you at all, type the word steady in the comments, because staying steady through what came next was the hardest thing I've had to do since I buried my wife. And a quick note before we continue, some names, locations, and small details in this account have been altered, and certain moments have been reconstructed for narrative clarity, but the core of what happened is drawn from a real and painful pattern that plays out in families more often than any of us want to admit. Regina wasn't finished. 2 weeks into her investigation, she asked me to come by her office, a converted spare bedroom in her house with 3 filing cabinets and a corkboard that looked like something out of a television crime drama. She had a folder waiting for me on her desk. Walter, I need to ask you something first, she said. Do you have a trust set up? Something for Ashley, for the future? I did. Diane and I had established the Diane and Walter Higgins Family Trust in 2015, funded initially with $200,000 from the sale of a rental property we'd owned, and grown over the years through careful investment to just over $640,000 by the time Diane died. The terms were simple. Ashley would receive full access to the principal on her 40th birthday, or upon my death, whichever came first, with smaller annual disbursements available before that for documented needs, education, medical expenses, a down payment on a home. My attorney, a woman named Priya Nair who had handled our estate planning for a decade, administered the disbursement requests and reported to me twice a year. When's the last time you looked at the disbursement records? Regina asked. Priya sends me a summary every June and December, I said. Everything's been normal. A withdrawal for Ashley's wedding photography 2 years ago, a withdrawal for a car repair last year. Regina slid a printout across the desk. It was a public records search, county clerk's office, showing a uniform commercial code filing from 4 months earlier. Brandon Cole, my son-in-law, had taken out a business loan of $93,000 from a private lender to fund what the filing described as a franchise acquisition, a chain of car detailing shops. The collateral listed on the loan was, in part, anticipated distribution from beneficiary interest in the Diane and Walter Higgins Family Trust. I read it 3 times before it made sense. Brandon had gone to a lender and used my dead wife's trust, the one I still controlled, the one that wasn't supposed to fully belong to Ashley for another 15 years, as collateral for a business loan. Which meant somewhere, somehow, he and Ashley had represented to a lender that Ashley had a legal claim to money she did not yet have any right to touch. How is that even possible? I asked. The trust doesn't vest for 15 years. It's possible, Regina said carefully, if somebody showed the lender a document suggesting otherwise. An amendment. A letter from the trustee. Something that makes it look like the terms have changed, or that an early release has already been approved. My stomach dropped the way it had the night I saw that photograph. Priya would never approve an early release without talking to me first. I know, Regina said. That's exactly why I think you need to call her today, not tomorrow, today, and ask her directly whether anyone has contacted her office about this trust in the last 6 months. I called Priya from Regina's driveway before I'd even started my car. She picked up on the second ring, and when I explained what I'd found, there was a long pause on her end that told me everything before she said a word. Walter, she said slowly, in August, my office received a phone call from someone identifying themselves as a loan officer at a private lending firm, asking to verify the terms of the trust for underwriting purposes. My paralegal, following standard verification protocol, confirmed only that the trust existed and that Ashley was a named beneficiary. She did not confirm vesting terms or provide any documents. But Walter, there's something else. 2 weeks after that call, my office received a fax, purportedly from you, requesting a summary letter describing the trust's current balance and confirming that a partial early distribution had been discussed and was under consideration. My paralegal, new at the time, drafted a preliminary letter in response before I caught it and told her to stop. I never signed anything. But a draft letter with my letterhead did leave this office before I intercepted it. I sat in my car in Regina's driveway with the phone pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark, and I understood, for the first time, that this was not a daughter who had made one bad decision under financial pressure. This was a plan, built in stages, over months, involving forged requests and a business loan and a lender who believed my dead wife's trust was collateral for a car detailing franchise. If you're feeling what I felt in that moment, drop a comment with the word forged, because that single word from Priya changed everything about how I approached the rest of this. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I had handed Ashley her mother's rings, and I made a list, the way I used to make lists at the hardware supply company when a shipment went missing and I needed to trace it back through every hand that had touched it. On one side of the list I wrote what I knew for certain. The ring, sold in March, $11,200. The honeymoon, booked in April, cost roughly matching. The loan, taken out by Brandon in June, $93,000, using the trust as claimed collateral. The forged fax to Priya's office, sent in August. On the other side of the list, I wrote what I didn't know. Whether Ashley had actually signed anything herself. Whether this was Brandon's idea or hers. Whether there were other debts, other lenders, other pieces of this I hadn't found yet. Regina came back to me 4 days later with an answer to at least one of those questions, and it was the one that hurt the most. She had pulled Brandon's full credit history, legally available through channels she was licensed to access as part of the loan collateral dispute research Priya had authorized once the forged facts came to light. Brandon Cole was $31,000 in credit card debt before the wedding. He had been let go from a sales position 8 months before proposing to Ashley, a fact he had apparently never disclosed to me, and had told Ashley and everyone else he was between opportunities while actually drawing unemployment and picking up gig work. The car detailing franchise loan was not his first attempt to solve his financial problems using someone else's money. 6 months before the trust incident, he had attempted to open a home equity line of credit using his own late grandmother's house in Ohio, a property he did not legally own, listing himself as executor of an estate that had, according to Regina's record search, already been fully settled and distributed to 3 other cousins 2 years earlier. "Walter," Regina told me over the phone, her voice careful in the way people get when they're about to say something they know will land hard, "I don't think your daughter married a man who fell on hard times. I think she married a man with a pattern. I want to tell you something honest here, because I promised myself when I started sharing this that I would not sundown my own failures to make myself look better. I had noticed things about Brandon over the 2 years he and Ashley dated. Small things. He always seemed to know exactly what to say to make Diane's memory work in his favor, mentioning her at just the right moments, tearing up on cue at just the right stories. He asked me detailed questions about the trust at Thanksgiving dinner 18 months before the wedding, questions I answered honestly because I had no reason not to, because he was going to be family, because Ashley loved him and I wanted, more than almost anything after losing Diane, to believe that love was enough of a filter to keep bad people out of our lives. It isn't. I know that now in a way I wish I had known it then. I want to back up for a moment, because there's a piece of this I haven't told you yet, and it matters more than I understood at the time. 2 days after Regina told me about the credit history and the grandmother's house scheme, she called me again, this time asking me to come to her office rather than telling me over the phone, which by then I understood was her way of preparing me for something heavier than the last thing. "Walter, I want to show you something, and I want you to sit down before I do," she said. Saturday. She slid a printed email chain across the desk, 6 pages, pulled from a public records request tied to a small claims filing in a neighboring county. It turned out Brandon's grandmother, a woman named Ruth Cole, had passed away in 2021, and her modest estate, a house worth roughly $110,000, had been split 3 ways between Brandon and 2 cousins, Denise and Marcus Whitfield, exactly as I'd been told. What I hadn't been told, because Regina had only just found it, was that 8 months before Ruth Cole died, Brandon had convinced his grandmother, who was by then suffering from early-stage dementia, to sign a document naming him sole executor and granting him limited power of attorney over her finances in case anything happens before the will is updated. The cousins had discovered this only after Ruth's death, when the estate came up short by nearly $18,000 that had been withdrawn in cash over the preceding 6 months. They had threatened a lawsuit. Brandon had settled quietly out of court for $12,000, admitting no wrongdoing, in an agreement that included a confidentiality clause, which was precisely why none of it had ever reached me, or Ashley, through any ordinary channel. "He did this before," I said, more to myself than to Regina. "He did this to his own grandmother while she was losing her memory." "I believe he did," Regina said. "And Walter, I want to be careful here, because a settlement with a confidentiality clause isn't a conviction, it isn't even an admission in any legal sense. But it's a pattern, and patterns matter. A man who convinces an elderly relative to sign over financial authority once, and quietly settles when family notices money missing, is not a man who stumbled into a crisis. He is a man who has a method, and your daughter, and your trust, was simply the next application of that method." I sat with that for a long time in Regina's office, the kind of silence that isn't really silence at all, just a mind working too hard to make any noise. I thought about every dinner Brandon had sat through at my table, every time he'd asked, with what I'd taken for polite interest, how the trust's investments were performing, whether I'd considered moving any of it into a different vehicle for tax purposes, whether Priya's fees were reasonable compared to other estate attorneys he'd heard about. I had answered every one of those questions honestly, the way you answer a son-in-law's questions, because I had no reason then to imagine I was being quietly mapped. "There's one more thing," Regina said, and I remember bracing myself before she even finished the sentence. I ran a broader search on the lending firm behind the $93,000 loan. It's not a bank. It's a private lender that specializes in what the industry calls asset-based bridge financing, which is a polite way of saying they lend to people who can't qualify anywhere legitimate, at interest rates that would make your eyes water, secured against whatever collateral the borrower can talk them into accepting. I spoke to a contact who used to work in that world. He told me these lenders don't usually verify collateral claims very carefully, because they charge enough interest that they don't actually need the collateral to be real. They just need enough of a paper trail to justify the loan on their books if anyone ever asks. Which means Brandon likely knew, going in, that the trust collateral claim was flimsy. He wasn't trying to fool a bank examiner. He was trying to fool just enough people, for just long enough, to get the cash in hand. I drove home from Regina's office that afternoon with all of this sitting in my chest like a stone, and I remember pulling into my driveway and sitting there with the engine off for nearly 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. Diane's garden, the one I still maintained every spring in her honor even though I had no talent for it and the tomatoes always came in lopsided, was visible through the windshield, and I found myself talking to her out loud, the way I still do sometimes when the house is quiet. "I don't know what to do about this, Diane," I said. "Our girl married a man who does this for a living, near enough, and I don't know how much of it she knows, and I don't know how to find out without breaking something that might not be fixable afterward." The garden didn't answer, of course. But saying it out loud helped me get through the front door that night, and some nights, that's all you need. A quick note before we go further into this. What follows involves legal proceedings, financial fraud, and a family confrontation that was, by any measure, one of the hardest evenings of my life. Some specific details and dialogue have been reconstructed from memory and adapted for the telling, but the substance of what occurred is real. If you need to step away here, I understand completely. For those staying with me, comment the word ready, because I was anything but ready, and I want you to know that going in is normal. With Regina's findings and Priya's confirmation of the forged facts in hand, I made an appointment with Priya for the following Monday. Her office sat on the second floor of a converted Victorian on Chestnut Street, the kind of building with creaky stairs and a receptionist who'd worked there longer than I'd been a client. Priya was 61, silver-haired, meticulous in a way that had made her worth every dollar Diane and I had ever paid her. "Walter," she said, once I'd laid out everything Regina had found, spreading the pawn shop photograph, the UCC filing, the credit history summary across her desk like a man laying out a hand of cards he never wanted to be dealt. "I need you to understand the legal landscape here clearly. The trust itself is intact. No money has actually left it. Ashley has no legal right to touch the principal for 15 more years, and the forged fax, thank God, was caught by my paralegal before it left this office in a form anyone could rely on. But what we have is evidence of an attempted fraud against a private lender, using your trust as false collateral, and evidence that someone, likely Brandon, attempted to impersonate you or represent your authority without consent. What does that mean for Ashley?" I asked. "Legally." Priya folded her hands the way lawyers do when they're about to tell you something you don't want to hear. "It means you have decisions to make that go beyond the law. Legally, you have every right to restructure this trust today, this afternoon, if you want to. You are the surviving grantor. Diane's portion passed to you upon her death, giving you sole authority to amend, restrict, or revoke the terms during your lifetime, so long as you're competent to do so, which you very obviously are. You could remove Ashley as beneficiary entirely. You could restructure the trust to a different vesting schedule, to a spendthrift provision that limits disbursements to specific documented needs administered entirely through this office with no direct access to Ashley at all. You could redirect it to a charitable purpose. The law gives you enormous latitude here, Walter. The harder question is what you actually want to do as her father. I sat with that question for 3 days before I answered it, and during those 3 days, I did something I am not entirely proud of, though I don't regret it either. I let Ashley keep believing nothing had changed. She called me twice that week, cheerful, asking if I wanted to come for Sunday dinner, telling me about a new furniture set she and Brandon were considering for their living room. I said yes to dinner. I asked about the furniture. I did not mention the ring, or the loan, or the forged fax sitting in a folder in my glove compartment. Regina had taught me that much, at least. You do not tip your hand until you know exactly what you intend to do with it. What I decided, over those 3 days, sitting alone in the house Diane and I had shared for 31 years, was this. I was not going to destroy my daughter's life over a ring, no matter how much that ring had meant to me. But I was also not going to sit quietly while a man who had lied about his job, his debts, and his grandmother's estate used my late wife's memory as collateral for a car wash franchise. Whatever happened next, Ashley was going to have to look me in the eye and account for what she had done, with real consequences attached, or the trust her mother and I had built with 3 decades of careful saving was going to stop being something she could count on. Please comment the word confront if you think that's exactly what I decided to do, because that Sunday dinner she'd invited me to, the one about furniture and cheerful small talk, was the dinner I chose for the reckoning. I asked Priya to come. I asked Regina to be present as well, not hidden, not secretive this time, but seated at the table as what I described to Ashley only as a friend joining us. I told Ashley I wanted to bring dessert and that I had something to discuss with her and Brandon about the trust, framing it as routine, an old man wanting to talk through his estate planning while he still had his wits about him. She sounded pleased. Of course, Dad. We'd love to talk about the future with you. I wonder now, knowing what I know, whether some part of her assumed I was calling that meeting to discuss moving up her distribution timeline. I will never know for certain, and honestly, I have made peace with not knowing. Sunday arrived, the second Sunday of November, cold and overcast, the kind of grey that sits low over Ohio in late fall. I dressed carefully, the same navy sport coat I'd worn to Diane's funeral, not out of any symbolism I planned in advance, but because it was the coat that made me feel most like myself when I needed to be steady. Priya and Regina followed in Priya's car and parked 2 houses down, as we'd planned, walking up 10 minutes after I arrived so it wouldn't look coordinated from the start. Ashley answered the door in an apron, flour on her hands, genuinely happy to see me, and something in my chest ached at how easily I could still see, underneath everything Regina and I had uncovered, the little girl who used to help her mother bake on Sunday afternoons. Brandon shook my hand with the same firm, slightly too long grip he always used, the handshake of a man who had read somewhere that a strong handshake conveys trustworthiness. We ate dinner first. Roast chicken, the recipe Diane used to make, which struck me as almost cruel in a way Ashley couldn't have intended. Brandon talked about the detailing franchise, how the first location was already generating interest, how they were just waiting on some financing paperwork to clear before breaking ground on a second location. I listened, nodding, asking the questions a supportive father-in-law would ask, while Priya and Regina sat quietly at the far end of the table, introduced simply as old friends from the Rotary Club and my law office respectively, details true enough not to raise suspicion. At 7:45, after the plates were cleared, I asked Ashley if we could talk about the trust. She brightened immediately, reaching for Brandon's hand under the table in a gesture I don't think she realized I noticed. Of course, Dad. What's on your mind? I reached into my jacket and set the pawn shop photograph on the table, face up, turned toward her. The room went quiet in a way that rooms only go quiet when everyone at the table understands, all at once, that something has shifted. Do you recognize this ring? I asked. Ashley's face did something complicated, several emotions passing across it faster than she could organize them into a single expression. Dad, I can explain. I'd like you to, I said, and I kept my voice level, the way Regina had coached me to, not because I wasn't furious, but because I had learned, over 40 years running a business, that the person who stays calm in a confrontation is the person who ends up controlling it. Because this photograph comes from Gallows Pawn and Jewelry, dated March 14th of this year. Your ID. Your signature. $11,200 for a diamond ring matching the exact description and appraisal of your mother's engagement ring. Brandon started to say something. I held up a hand, and to my own surprise, he actually stopped. I sold it, Ashley said quietly, tears already starting. Dad, I'm so sorry. We needed the money for the honeymoon deposit and I panicked and I told myself I'd buy it back before you ever noticed. I told myself I'd find a way to get it back. With what money? I asked. Because for months after you sold your mother's ring, Brandon took out a $93,000 loan listing the Higgins family trust as collateral. A trust you don't have legal access to for another 15 years. And 2 weeks before that loan closed, someone sent a forged fax to Priya Nair's office, pretending to be me, requesting confirmation that an early distribution was under consideration. The color drained from Ashley's face in a way that told me, with total certainty, that this part was new information to her. Brandon, she said slowly, turning to him. What is he talking about? Brandon's composure, which had held through the ring revelation, cracked visibly at the mention of the loan. I was going to tell you once the second location was profitable, he said. It was just a bridge loan, Ash, just until the business started generating enough to pay it back on its own. I never meant for it to touch the actual trust, I just needed the lender to see there was collateral coming eventually. You forged a document from my father's lawyer, Ashley said, her voice rising. Using my mother's trust. I didn't forge anything, Brandon said, too quickly, in the specific way people talk when they are about to say something they know is a lie. I used a service. A document prep company. They said it was standard for bridge financing. Priya, who had been silent until this point, spoke for the first time. Mr. Cole, my office has the facts on record, along with the phone log from the verification call your lender's underwriter placed in August. We also have the metadata from the document itself. I'd encourage you to think carefully before you say anything else at this table, because everything you say tonight, I am required to treat as potentially relevant to a fraud claim, and I will not hesitate to refer this matter to the county prosecutor's financial crimes unit if it comes to that. The silence that followed lasted, by my count, almost 30 full seconds. Ashley was crying in earnest now, not the composed tears from a moment before but the kind that come from somewhere deeper. Dad, I swear I didn't know about the loan. I sold the ring. That was me, that was my mistake, and I will spend the rest of my life regretting it. But I didn't know about this. Then let me ask you something else, I said, and I looked at Brandon directly for the first time since the ring photograph had gone down on the table. Tell me about your grandmother's house. I watched something happen behind his eyes, a door closing that he hadn't expected anyone to even know existed. That's got nothing to do with tonight, he said, too fast, the same rhythm he'd used about the document prep company a minute earlier. Ruth Cole, I said. Power of attorney, 8 months before she died, $18,000 that came up missing from her estate, and a settlement with your cousins that came with a confidentiality clause so nobody in this family would ever hear about it. Does that sound about right? Ashley's head turned toward him so fast I heard her chair creak. Brandon! What is he talking about? It was a family matter, Brandon said, and his voice had lost the smoothness it carried at the start of dinner, replaced by something thinner and more defensive. Denise and Marcus blew it out of proportion. Grandma wanted me to help her manage things near the end. She trusted me more than she trusted them, and yes, some money went missing, but I paid it back. I settled it. It's done. You settled it quietly, Priya said from the end of the table, because a public dispute would have exposed exactly the kind of pattern we're looking at tonight. Mr. Cole, I want to be plain with you. I've spent 30 years around estate documents, and what you're describing is not family disagreement. It's a rehearsal. Brandon stood up then, his chair scraping hard against the hardwood, his face flushed in a way I hadn't seen from him before, not even at the wedding when his own father had given a rambling, half-drunk toast that had embarrassed everyone at the reception. This is unbelievable, he said. You're ambushing me at a dinner table with a private investigator and a lawyer like I'm on trial. This is Ashley's family, this is supposed to be a safe place. It was, I said quietly, until you decided my dead wife's memory was a line item on a loan application. Ashley put her face in her hands. When she looked up again, she was looking at Brandon, not at me, and something in her expression had shifted entirely, the last of whatever benefit of the doubt she'd been extending him for the last several minutes visibly draining away. How long, she said, her voice low and careful in a way that frightened me more than her tears had. How long have you been doing this? Not just the loan. How long have you been someone who does this? Brandon didn't answer. He looked at the table, at his hands, at the door, everywhere except at his wife's face, and in my experience, a man who cannot meet his wife's eyes when she asks him a direct question has already answered it. I believed her about the loan. I want to be honest with you about that, because this story isn't interesting if I pretend every villain in it was equally villainous. But I did not believe, and still don't fully believe, that she was entirely unaware something had shifted in her marriage, that Brandon's finances had become desperate enough to reach for things that weren't his. I need you to understand something, I said, and this is the part of that evening I have replayed in my mind more than any other. Your mother and I built that trust so that you would always have something steady underneath you, no matter what happened in your life. Not so it could become collateral for a business your husband can't afford to run honestly. Not so it could be dangled in front of a lender by forging my lawyer's letterhead. I'm not here tonight to punish you for grief, or for a bad decision made under pressure about a ring. I'm here because I need to know whether the trust your mother and I built is still safe, or whether it's already been treated like something that belongs to people who are willing to lie to get at it. What are you going to do? Ashley asked, her voice small in a way I hadn't heard since she was a teenager. Effective this week, I said, I'm restructuring the trust. You will remain a named beneficiary, because you are my daughter and nothing that happened tonight changes that fact. But the terms are changing. No lump sum vesting at 40. No access at all without direct, documented need, administered entirely through Priya's office, with every disbursement request reviewed and approved by me personally while I'm alive, and by an independent trustee after I'm gone. And Brandon's name will be formally excluded from any authority over those funds, now and permanently, regardless of what happens in your marriage. Brandon stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped. You can't do that. That trust is basically Ashley's inheritance. It was never yours to begin with, I said, and for the first time all evening, I let my voice carry the full weight of what I was feeling. You used a dead woman's memory to backstop a business loan you couldn't get honestly. You are lucky I am not calling Detective Marsh at the county sheriff's office tonight instead of having this conversation at my daughter's dinner table. I want to pause the story here and ask you directly, because I've thought about this moment more than any other in the entire ordeal. If you were in my position, would you have gone further that night, called the police immediately, pressed charges on the spot? Or would you have done what I did, which was give my daughter one more chance to choose, in that moment, who she was going to be? Comment your honest answer below, because I still don't know if I made the right call. What I did, in the end, was tell them both that they had 1 week. 1 week for Brandon to formally withdraw the loan application and provide documentation proving the collateral claim had been rescinded, and 1 week for Ashley to decide, honestly, whether she was going to stand beside a man who had done this, or whether she needed some distance to think clearly about her own life. I told them I was not issuing an ultimatum about the marriage itself, that was never mine to control, and I said so plainly. But I told them the trust restructuring was not negotiable, and that if the loan collateral claim wasn't formally rescinded within 7 days, Priya would refer the entire matter, forged facts and all, to the prosecutor's office, regardless of what either of them decided about anything else. They took the week. Brandon, to his limited credit, did contact the lender and formally withdrew the collateral claim, providing a notarized letter that Priya verified independently rather than simply accepting at face value. The loan itself was restructured against different collateral, something involving equipment financing through the franchise company directly, which was, as Priya put it, finally the honest way to have done this in the first place. Ashley moved out of the house she shared with Brandon on the 5th day of that week, staying with a college friend while she, in her words, figured out what she actually wanted her life to look like. I want to tell you that this was purely about the fraud, but I think, if I'm honest, it was about a slower accumulation of things she'd been avoiding looking at directly, and the dinner table confrontation simply removed the option of looking away any longer. I did not press criminal charges against Brandon. Priya advised me that I could have, that the elements of attempted fraud were well documented, and that a prosecutor would likely have taken the case seriously given the paper trail Regina and I had assembled. I chose not to, for reasons that took me a long time to fully understand myself. Part of it was Ashley, still standing in the wreckage of a marriage she'd entered in good faith, even if she'd made her own mistakes along the way. Part of it was Diane, whose memory I did not want tangled up in a courtroom, whose ring I wanted to remember as something that had once been sold in a moment of panic and not as an exhibit number in a criminal proceeding. If you're still with me, and I know this has been a long road, drop the word healing in the comments, because that's what the 6 months after that dinner actually looked like, slow, uneven, and far less dramatic than the confrontation itself. Regina helped me track down the ring itself, still sitting in Gallows inventory, unsold, because as it turned out, distinctive estate pieces with an unusual setting take longer to move than a pawnbroker likes to admit. I bought it back for $14,000, more than Ashley had sold it for, because that's simply what the market had done in the intervening months, and I did not begrudge a single dollar of it. I put it back in the safe deposit box at Fairhaven Trust and Savings, where it sits today, waiting for a moment I'd trust more fully than I trusted the last one. Before any of that could happen, there was one more piece of business that had to be settled, and it took nearly 2 months to resolve. Priya insisted, and I agreed, that we could not simply take Brandon's word that the collateral claim had been withdrawn. She hired an independent forensic accountant, a quiet, precise woman named Farah Bell, to trace every document connected to the loan from origination to closure. Farah's report, delivered in early January, confirmed that the lender had indeed removed the trust language from the collateral schedule and replaced it with a lien against the franchise equipment itself, as Brandon had claimed. But her report also turned up something none of us had specifically asked her to look for. Brandon had, in the 2 weeks before our confrontation dinner, opened a second, smaller personal loan of $9,000 using Ashley's name as a joint applicant, without, according to Ashley's own sworn statement to Priya's office, her knowledge or signature on the actual application, only a signature she recalled providing on what she'd been told was insurance paperwork for the house. That discovery changed the shape of everything that followed. Priya advised Ashley to report the unauthorized loan application to the lender's fraud department immediately, both to protect her own credit and to establish a clear record that she herself had been a victim of identity misuse within her own marriage, not merely a bystander to Brandon's schemes. Ashley did so the same week, and the loan was frozen and eventually voided once the lender's internal investigation corroborated her account, helped considerably by the notarized signature comparison Farah Bell had already prepared as part of her broader report. It was this second forgery, more than anything from the original dinner table confrontation, that finally pushed Ashley to file for divorce rather than simply separating to think things over, as she'd initially told me she intended to do. She called me on a Tuesday evening in December, her voice steadier than I had heard it in months, and told me she'd retained her own attorney, separate from Priya, specifically for the divorce proceedings, because she said she needed something in her life right now that belonged entirely to her, chosen entirely by her, with no overlap with anything her father or her soon-to-be ex-husband had touched. I told her that was exactly right, and I meant it more than almost anything I'd said to her all year. The divorce itself took for months to finalize, slowed mostly by disputes over the collapsing franchise debt rather than anything involving me or the trust, since Priya had made certain, through the restructuring, that the trust itself was legally shielded from any marital asset claims Brandon's attorney might otherwise have attempted to raise. There was one afternoon, during a mediation session Ashley later described to me in detail, where Brandon's attorney floated the idea that Ashley's expectation of future trust income should factor into the division of marital debt, essentially trying to argue that Ashley owed some portion of the family's shared credit card debt because she stood to inherit money eventually. Priya, sitting in as an observer at Ashley's request, reportedly said only one sentence in response, delivered with the flat precision I had come to appreciate over a decade of watching her work. The trust vests to Ashley alone, was restructured 8 months ago specifically to exclude any claim by Mr. Cole, and if opposing counsel would like to relitigate that point, I would be delighted to introduce the forensic accounting report into the record. The subject, according to Ashley, did not come up again. Ashley finalized her divorce from Brandon in the spring of the following year. It was not a dramatic proceeding. There was little property to divide once the franchise venture collapsed under its own debt within 4 months of our confrontation, exactly as Regina had predicted it would, given how thin the underlying financing had actually been. Brandon moved out of state, according to the last update I received, and I have made peace with the fact that I will likely never see him again, which is, if I'm being completely honest with you, a relief rather than a loss. Ashley and I rebuilt our relationship slowly, over dinners that started stilted and awkward and gradually became something closer to what we'd had before Diane died. The first few of those dinners, I'll admit, were difficult in ways I hadn't expected. We would sit across from each other at the same restaurant we used to visit with Diane, ordering the same dishes out of habit, and neither of us quite knew how to talk about anything that mattered without circling back, eventually, to the dinner table confrontation and everything that had led up to it. I remember one evening in January, maybe 6 weeks after the divorce filing, when Ashley set down her fork and asked me, point blank, whether I still trusted her. I sat with that question longer than she probably expected me to. "I trust that you love your mother's memory," I finally said. "I trust that you were scared and in over your head and made a decision you're going to carry for a long time. I don't yet trust your judgment the way I used to, and I think it's going to take both of us a while to earn that back, me included, because I should have paid closer attention to Brandon a long time before any of this happened." She cried at the table that night, but it was a different kind of crying than the kind at the confrontation dinner, quieter, without the edge of panic underneath it, and I think we both left that restaurant feeling like something honest had finally been said out loud between us instead of managed around. She went to therapy, on her own initiative, not because I asked her to, and she told me things in those months that I had never fully understood about the pressure she'd felt trying to build a life that looked successful enough to be worthy of the sacrifices Diane and I had made for her. She told me, one evening over coffee, that she had felt for years like she was competing against a version of her mother she could never quite live up to, that Diane's memory had become, without either of us intending it, a kind of silent measuring stick she felt she was always failing to reach. She said that when Brandon suggested selling the ring, framing it as just this once, just to get us started right, some small, exhausted part of her had been relieved to finally do something that felt like it was hers to decide, even though she knew, even as she signed the pawn shop paperwork, that it was wrong. I don't offer that as an excuse. I offer it because understanding it helped me stop asking the question that had haunted me for months, which was simply how could she, and start asking a more useful one, which was what do we both need to do differently now? None of that excuses what she did. I want to be clear about that because I think there's a temptation in stories like this to wrap everything up with a bow that makes the betrayal feel smaller than it was. It doesn't feel smaller to me. It feels like something I will carry, quietly, for the rest of my life, folded in with the grief of losing Diane in the first place. But I have also learned, over this past year, that a person can do something unforgivable and still be worth forgiving, if the forgiveness comes with clear eyes and real boundaries attached rather than blind trust restored exactly as it was before. The trust restructuring stands as it did the night I announced it. Ashley receives documented distributions for real, verified needs, reviewed by Priya's office, and nothing more, and she has told me more than once that she is grateful for that structure now, that it protects her from herself as much as it protects the money from anyone else who might come looking for it in the future. I should also tell you what happened to the people who helped me through all of this, because I think they deserve more than a passing mention in a story that was, in large part, only survivable because of them. Regina Alvarez still meets me for coffee every few weeks at that same diner on Route 9, and she has told me more than once that of all the cases she's worked in her retirement, mine is the one she thinks about most, not because of the money involved, which was modest by the standards of the fraud cases she used to investigate professionally, but because of how close I came to simply not looking, to letting a photograph on a phone screen slide past without a second thought. Most people don't call someone like me, she told me once. Most people talk themselves out of it in about a week, the way you almost did, and by the time they finally admit something's wrong, whatever was taken is long gone and untraceable. You called me on day 2. That's the only reason any of this was recoverable at all. Priya Ne continues to administer the restructured trust exactly as we agreed that November, and she has become, over this past year, something closer to a family friend than simply the woman who manages our finances. She was there, at my invitation, for Ashley's small birthday dinner this past summer, and I noticed, watching the two of them talk easily across the table about nothing in particular, movies and recipes and the unreasonable price of groceries, that some of the coldness that had crept into every professional conversation during the confrontation months had finally melted away into something more like warmth. Priya told me privately, near the end of that evening, that she had seen dozens of families go through something like this over her career, and that the ones who came out the other side intact were never the ones who avoided the hard conversation. They were the ones who had it, however badly it went in the moment, and then kept showing up afterward. As for Brandon, I heard through a mutual acquaintance about 8 months after the divorce was finalized that he had moved to a different state entirely and was reportedly involved in some new business venture, the details of which I did not ask for and do not particularly want. I hope, in whatever quiet way an old man can hope for someone who hurt his family, that he finds some version of honesty in himself eventually, if only because I would not wish the pattern Regina described, the pattern that started with his own grandmother, to keep repeating itself against some other family down the line, some other trusting father-in-law who hasn't yet learned to ask the questions I wish I had asked 2 years earlier. Here's what I want you to take from this, if you take nothing else. The people we love most are not incapable of betraying us, and loving someone completely does not obligate you to trust them blindly forever, especially not with something you built for their protection in the first place. Diane and I did not build that trust so it could become collateral for someone else's ambition. We built it so our daughter would always have something steady underneath her, and steady does not mean unguarded. If something in your gut tells you a ring looks different in a photograph, or a phone call to your lawyer's office sounds unfamiliar, or a son-in-law asks a few too many detailed questions about money that isn't his, do not talk yourself out of that feeling the way I nearly did. Investigate quietly. Gather what you need before you confront anyone. And when the moment comes to speak the truth out loud, at whatever dinner table it happens to be, say it plainly, and mean every consequence you attach to it. I still keep Diane's ring in that safe deposit box. I visit it more often than is probably necessary, not to check that it's still there, but because holding it for a few minutes, even through the sterile fluorescent light of a bank vault room, still feels like the closest thing I have left to holding her hand. One day, I hope, it will go to a granddaughter who never has to know the whole story behind why her grandfather guarded it so carefully. But if she ever does need to know, I hope she reads this and understands that some things are worth protecting even after the people who trusted you with them are already gone, especially then. There's a small ritual I've started doing, and I want to share it with you before I close this out, because it's helped me more than I expected it to. On the second Sunday of every month, I sit at the same kitchen table where I handed Ashley her mother's rings, where I later spread out a pawn shop photograph and changed the course of both our lives, and I write down one thing I'm grateful for that has nothing to do with any of this. Some months it's small, the way the light comes through the kitchen window in autumn, or a phone call from Ashley that was just ordinary, just about nothing, no crisis attached to it at all. I do this because Regina told me once, near the end of all this, that people who go through something like what I went through tend to let the betrayal become the whole shape of their memory, crowding out everything that came before and everything that might still come after. I did not want that to happen to me, and more than that, I did not want it to happen to how I remember Diane, whose life was so much bigger and gentler than the worst thing that happened to the ring she wore for 34 years. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. If this story meant something to you, if any part of it reminded you of your own family, your own trust, your own version of a ring that mattered more than its price, I'd genuinely love to hear about it in the comments below. Tell me what you would have done differently, or what you would have done the same. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing, because there are more stories like this one, ordinary people who found out the hard way that love and trust are not the same thing, and who had to learn, later than they wanted to, how to hold on to both without losing themselves in the process. One last note before I let you go. As I mentioned earlier, certain names, locations, and details throughout this account have been changed or adapted, and some scenes have been reconstructed for the sake of clarity and privacy. But the heart of what happened, the ring, the trust, the forged document, and the dinner table where I finally said the truth out loud, all of it is drawn from real patterns that happen in real families more often than any of us would like to admit. If this isn't the kind of story you enjoy, I understand completely, and I hope you find something else that serves you better. But if it resonated with you, thank you for walking through it with me. Take care of the people you love, and take care of the things you've built to protect them, because sometimes those are not the same task, and knowing the difference is the whole job of getting old.